The summer of 2008 had carried the Ellis family into one of those rare weekends when everyone managed to arrive at the same place at the same time. The reunion had been planned for months, a return to the weathered cabin tucked in the pines near Lake Greeley in northern Michigan. For years, it had been their gathering spot, layered with memories of fireworks, fishing trips, and nights of laughter that echoed across the lake. Claire Ellis, 39 years old, mother of two, had been looking forward to it more than she admitted. Life at home had been hectic, weighed down by work schedules and the endless rhythm of keeping a household moving. The cabin offered her something rare, a pause, a breath, and a reminder of who she was outside the daily grind. The first evening carried all the warmth and noise one would expect. Charcoal smoke drifted from the grill while children darted between the porch and the shoreline. Claire's daughter, Ava, chased minnows in the shallows, her younger brother Josh trailing behind with a plastic bucket, convinced he could scoop one out. Daniel, Claire's husband, hauled groceries into the kitchen, while her sister Lena arranged chairs around the fire pit. Their parents, June and Walter, moved more slowly now, leaning on each other as they stepped onto the porch, but their faces lit up at the sound of voices weaving together. For a moment, the cabin felt untouched by time, a place where the years melted into the background. Dinner stretched long into the evening. Burgers sizzled, children begged for seconds, and laughter rolled easily across the clearing. Claire seemed lighter as the night deepened, moving from one conversation to the next, pausing often to watch her children. When marshmallows began to roast, she leaned against Daniel, her smile tugging at the corners, even though her eyes carried tired shadows. She had looked worn for months, but here by the fire she allowed herself to soften. Sparks rose against the dark sky as voices gradually quieted, folding into the comfortable rhythm of family. By midnight, one by one, the family trickled into the cabin. Claire was the last to linger, tidying the porch, stacking plates, and blowing on the last embers of the fire. Upstairs, the children whispered in sleeping bags, reluctant to close their eyes, while the adults settled into creaking beds. In her room, Claire placed her glasses and phone on the nightstand, tucking herself beside Daniel, who was already asleep. She lay awake longer than usual, her mind restless despite the quiet. Outside, the lake lapped faintly against the dock, and crickets carried their constant song through the woods. The old house groaned and shifted with the cooling night. Eventually, Claire slipped from the bed, her steps soft across the wood floor. What happened between 2 and 3 in the morning has never been clear. No one saw her leave the cabin, no one heard the door open. But when the family woke at dawn, her side of the icy bed was cold. Her phone remained on the charger, her glasses folded neatly where she had left them. The porch door hung slightly open, letting in a thin breeze that carried the damp scent of pine and lake water. At first, Daniel believed she had woken early, maybe to walk along the dock or sit by the water. It was a habit she sometimes had, a way of finding quiet before the day began. But by 7 o'clock, when breakfast dishes clattered and there was still no sign of Claire, unease began to spread. Daniel stepped out to the clearing, expecting to spot her figure against the shoreline. Instead, the lake stretched out untouched, a layer of mist curling above its surface. He called her name once, then again, his voice breaking the calm. The children followed, convinced their mother was hiding, but there was nothing. Her shoes remained by the door. No prints disturbed the wet soil leading into the woods. It was as though she had stepped outside and vanished into air. The first wave of panic settled in the pit of Daniel's stomach. He dialed Claire's phone, only to hear its muffled ring from the nightstand. He began pacing, voice sharp with disbelief, as relatives tried to calm him. Lena finally reached for the landline, her hands shaking as she explained what had happened. Saying the words aloud made them feel impossible. By 8 o'clock, the call to 911 had been made. What had been a family reunion only hours earlier was now the site of a missing persons case. Sheriff's deputies arrived quickly, their vehicles lining the dirt driveway. Questions followed immediately. Had Claire been upset? Had she fought with Daniel? Was there any reason she might want to leave? Each question landed like a blow. June clung to Walter's arm, whispering that her daughter would never walk away from her children. Ava stood barefoot on the porch, staring out at the woods, asking over and over when her mother was coming back. The deputies spread across the clearing, marking the ground with cautious steps, but the silence of the scene gave them little to work with. By noon, the search had expanded. Dogs strained at their leashes, handlers calling commands into the trees. A helicopter swept low, its blades chopping through the stillness, while cousins huddled together near the fire pit. The laughter of the night before had been erased, replaced by the steady drumbeat of fear. For the family, time seemed to collapse. They had come here for tradition, for comfort, for one more memory together. Instead, they stood on the porch of a cabin that suddenly felt foreign, watching strangers scour the land for a woman who should have been inside making breakfast. As night fell for the second time, one thought bound them all in silence. Claire was gone, and nobody could explain how. The first hours after Claire's absence were marked by disbelief. At the cabin, voices carried her name into the woods, repeating it louder each time as if volume alone might coax her back. Daniel moved along the shoreline, scanning the water's edge for footprints, while his sister Lena combed the dirt road leading to the main highway. The children trailed behind with nervous energy, convinced their mother was hiding, that this was a game she would soon end with a laugh. But each shouted call met only with the quiet rush of leaves and the steady lap of the lake against the dock. By mid-morning, the mood shifted from confusion to fear. Deputies had already arrived and were taking statements, their radios crackling as they called in reinforcements. They began their work methodically, first walking the perimeter of the property, then marking off trails that wound into the woods. Neighbors were questioned, though few had seen anything in the early hours of dawn. One couple recalled hearing dogs bark in the night, but nothing unusual followed. For investigators, the detail was too vague to carry weight. Daniel insisted again and again that Claire had not left on foot. Her shoes were still by the porch door, lined neatly where she had left them the night before. Her glasses remained on the nightstand, her phone still plugged into the wall. Deputies wrote these observations into their notes, circling them as unusual. The absence of a struggle, the lack of belongings taken, the silence of the cabin. Together, it painted an unsettling picture. People who intend to disappear often leave behind chaos or some trace of planning. Here, there was only stillness. By noon, the search had expanded into a full-scale operation. K-9 units arrived, handlers leading dogs into the underbrush, hoping to catch her scent. The animals barked and pulled, only to loop back toward the cabin, circling as if trapped in confusion. Helicopters swept overhead, their thundering blades scattering flocks of birds as deputies scanned the treetops and clearings below. On the water, divers entered the lake in thick wetsuits, slipping beneath the surface one after another. Each time they resurfaced, the air on shore seemed to grow heavier, the silence of their reports deepening the sense of dread. Inside the cabin, the children were shielded from most of it, though they could sense the change. Ava sat curled in a chair, watching through the window as uniformed men in fluorescent vests moved across the property. Josh clutched a toy car, asking questions no one could answer. June tried to distract them with stories, but her hands shook each time she poured water into a glass. The atmosphere that had been filled with warmth and laughter less than a day before now hung thick with fear and disbelief. As evening approached, investigators gathered family members to review what they knew. Claire had last been seen by her husband around midnight. No one else reported hearing her leave the bedroom or walk through the house. The porch door had been open, but no one saw her step outside. Without footprints, without tire tracks, without a single disturbance to the environment, it was as if she had been erased. The deputies asked again whether Claire had seemed upset, whether she'd been drinking, whether she had spoken of leaving. Each answer was the same. No, she had not. That night, floodlights illuminated the clearing as search teams pressed deeper into the woods. Volunteers from town arrived with flashlights, forming lines and sweeping the area yard by yard. The hum of generators filled the silence, punctuated by whistles and calls as names echoed into the trees. But still, nothing surfaced. It was the kind of void investigators dreaded. No trace, no lead, no direction to follow. As the hours dragged on, Daniel's pacing grew frantic. He argued with deputies, insisting they weren't moving fast enough, that more should be done. Lena tried to calm him, but her own voice trembled as she spoke. Every minute felt like it mattered, and yet the search was uncovering nothing. The family was left standing on the edge of the porch, watching strangers sweep the land where they had grown up, laughing, wondering how something so impossible could unfold on such familiar ground. When dawn broke the following morning, the scene was unchanged. The lake shimmered with mist, the woods stretched out in silence, and Claire was still gone. Investigators compared notes and whispered among themselves. One deputy finally said aloud what everyone had begun to fear. She had vanished without leaving a trace. The case, from its very first hours, carried the weight of something unnatural. For the family, the panic of the first day had bled into something darker, a realization that whatever had happened to Claire, it was not going to be explained easily. And in that silence, suspicion would begin to take root. The first 24 hours slipped into 48, and the absence of results began to weigh heavily on everyone. Deputies, tired and mud-soaked from combing the woods, returned to the cabin for repeated interviews. Their questions circled back to the same person, Daniel, Claire's husband. Investigators always started closest to the missing, and Daniel, by default, became their focus. He was asked to recount the night again and again, what time they went to bed, when he last saw her, whether anything unusual had been said. Each version of his story was nearly identical, though the repetition made it sound rehearsed. The detectives took note, scribbling in their pads while Daniel's frustration grew. Relatives gathered in clusters on the porch and inside the living room, voices dropping into whispers when Daniel walked past. Some admitted quietly that Claire and Daniel had faced tension in their marriage, that arguments about money and parenting had left her worn down. Others insisted it was nothing serious, just the normal strain of two people raising children. But suspicion is contagious in moments like these, and soon the family was divided between those defending Daniel and those questioning what they didn't want to admit aloud. The detectives pressed on with their angle. They asked whether Daniel had been drinking that night, whether he'd been asleep when she left the bed, whether anyone could confirm his movements. He denied everything with rising anger, but the mere act of questioning planted seeds. Even Lena, his sister-in-law, who had once trusted him implicitly, found herself staring at him with hesitation, wondering if he knew more than he let on. The pressure mounted until Daniel snapped at deputies, demanding they search harder instead of interrogating him. Meanwhile, the children remained adrift in confusion. Ava clung to the idea that her mother had gone for a walk and gotten lost, that she would emerge from the trees once the searchers found her. Josh asked every officer who passed whether they had seen his mom. The innocence of their questions cut through the adults like knives. June, their grandmother, tried to shield them from the tension, but even they could sense the fracture forming within the family. Each whispered suspicion seemed to widen the distance between relatives who had gathered only days earlier for celebration. As days passed, the investigation shifted from frantic search to analytical dissection of Claire's life. Detectives dug through her phone records, bank accounts, and emails. They were looking for signs of an affair, financial trouble, or a planned escape. But nothing surfaced. No unusual withdrawals, no hidden messages, no hotel reservations waiting in her name. It was as though her life had simply paused the moment she stepped out of the cabin. That void made investigators uneasy. People do not vanish cleanly without leaving digital fingerprints, yet Claire's trail stopped abruptly, adding to the mystery. The lack of evidence only deepened divisions within the family. At dinner, silence hung over the table where laughter once flowed. Some believed Daniel was being unfairly targeted, while others confessed in hushed tones that they wondered if the deputies were right to push him. Daniel himself became increasingly defensive, distancing from relatives who doubted him. He walked the property alone, scouring the woods with a flashlight long after search teams had packed up for the night. To outsiders, it looked like determination, but to some family members, it looked like guilt manifesting as obsession. Detectives expanded their questioning to others. They asked about siblings, uncles, even neighbors who had dropped by. But each path led back to the same wall of uncertainty. Without evidence of foul play, they could not charge anyone. Without signs of voluntary disappearance, they could not close the case as a runaway. Claire existed in limbo, suspended between theories that satisfied no one. The emotional toll on the family was severe. Lena broke down after one interview, admitting she no longer knew what to believe. Walter, Claire's father, grew quiet, his silence speaking louder than any accusation. The children sensed the growing fracture, clinging closer to Daniel in moments that surprised even his harshest critics. But each day without Claire eroded patience and amplified doubt. By the end of the first week, the family no longer felt like a united front. They had arrived at the cabin as a circle of relatives bound by tradition and laughter, but now they stood fractured, watching each other with suspicion. Investigators left the property with more questions than answers, their notes filled with contradictions and theories that refused to align. The search was no longer just for Claire. It was for the truth about what had happened inside a family that was slowly unraveling. And as silence stretched further, detectives began to fear that whatever answers existed, they were buried deeper than anyone wanted to admit. The days after Claire's disappearance dragged into weeks, and the initial urgency of the search gave way to a kind of grinding exhaustion. Deputies still checked in with the family, but their visits grew shorter, their questions recycled from earlier interviews. Helicopters no longer circled overhead, and the dogs were returned to their kennels miles away. The search grids that once expanded into the woods now sat abandoned, orange tape sagging against tree trunks as reminders of a hope that was fading. In town, posters bearing Claire's face appeared on grocery store doors, gas station windows, and telephone poles. Her eyes looked out from the paper with the same tired warmth that relatives remembered from that last evening, a look that made some pause, convinced she could not simply have chosen to vanish. Tips began pouring in, flooding the sheriff's office. Drivers claimed to have seen a woman who looked like her walking along rural highways. Store clerks swore they recognized her from late-night visits. Each sighting was pursued, each one turning up empty. The cycle repeated until detectives began to quietly admit that most leads were nothing more than hopeful mistakes or cruel tricks of memory. Back at the cabin, the family returned home, but carried with them the weight of a place that no longer felt like their own. The laughter of that first night had been replaced by silence and suspicion. June and Walter kept the missing poster taped to their refrigerator, the edges curling as days passed. Lena threw herself into phone calls with law enforcement, checking daily for any progress. Daniel, under a cloud of suspicion, grew quieter, his temper flaring when relatives questioned him, but his grief undeniable in private moments when the children were asleep. For Ava and Josh, the posters served as painful reminders. Ava asked why her mother's picture was everywhere, but she was nowhere to be found. Josh grew restless, convinced the police weren't looking in the right places. Their childhoods were reshaped by that absence, each holiday and school event marked by the chair that remained empty. Detectives began scaling back their presence, resources stretched thin by other cases and limited manpower. At family meetings, they spoke in vague terms about keeping the file open and following up on leads, but their tone made clear that without new evidence, the case had stalled. The words no one wanted to hear, cold case, hung unspoken in the air, but the silence carried their meaning. Within the family, arguments deepened. Some clung to the idea that Claire had chosen to leave, a decision fueled by exhaustion or a desire for freedom. Others insisted she would never abandon her children, that foul play was the only explanation. The divide grew sharper each time a new false lead collapsed. When one caller claimed Claire was living under another name in Ohio, Daniel drove hours to follow it, only to return defeated. When another said she had been spotted at a motel 2 towns over, Lena arrived to find nothing but a woman who barely resembled her sister. Each disappointment chipped away at their hope. The community sympathy that had swelled in the first days began to fade. People whispered about Claire in tones of pity or speculation, each theory fueled by fragments of rumor. Some believed she had drowned and her body had simply never surfaced. Others were convinced she had orchestrated her own disappearance, leaving everything behind. The cruelty of those theories cut deep, especially for her children, who wanted to believe only that their mother was alive and waiting to come back. Months slipped by with little to anchor the family's grief. Birthdays came and went without her. Holidays gathered fewer relatives, the weight of her absence pressing down until even traditions felt hollow. Each new year passed marked another reminder that the investigation had not moved forward. Daniel lived under a shadow, the whispers never fully fading, though no evidence had ever placed guilt on him. Lena carried guilt of her own, haunted by the thought that she might have missed a sign that her sister was struggling. By the end of the first year, the case had settled into a painful routine. Posters that weathered in the rain, files that sat unopened on a sheriff's desk, and a family fractured by unanswered questions. The children grew older, forced to adapt to a new reality where their mother's name was spoken only in quiet tones. For those who loved her, despair became the constant companion, a dull ache that lingered in every empty chair, every family gathering. The grim truth was sinking in. Without evidence, without answers, they might never see Claire again. And yet, even as hope dwindled, the story of her disappearance was far from over. Months stretched into years, and what had once been a flurry of search efforts slowly dissolved into silence. The posters bearing Claire Ellis's face yellowed and curled at the edges, still taped to bulletin boards long after most people had stopped noticing them. At the sheriff's office, her case file grew thick with tips that led nowhere, maps marked with search grids that produced nothing, and interviews that never revealed a breakthrough. With no body, no evidence, and no confession, Claire's disappearance entered the limbo of unresolved mysteries. For her children, the years became defined by absence. Ava started high school carrying the weight of whispers from classmates who had seen her mother's name in old headlines. Every school project on family felt incomplete, every milestone hollowed by the missing figure in their photographs. Josh grew quieter with age, his childhood curiosity replaced by guarded silence. He avoided questions about his mother, but in private he saved every article he could find, trying to piece together a truth that adults around him had stopped pursuing. The Ellis family reunions, once a source of joy, became strained reminders of what had been lost. The cabin at Lake Greeley was avoided altogether, its shadow too heavy for anyone to bear. Gatherings in smaller homes carried a different tone now, voices hushed, conversations circling carefully around the subject everyone carried but rarely spoke aloud. Laughter returned in fragments, but always with a weight beneath it, an understanding that one chair would remain empty no matter how many years passed. For Daniel, life moved forward in fragments. He continued raising the children, shouldering the burden of being both parent and the figure of suspicion that had never quite faded. Every new detective assigned to the case brought another round of interviews, another demand for timelines and details he had repeated countless times. Each time he told the same story. Each time the case stalled in the same place. The frustration hardened into a quiet resignation, a man trapped between grief and suspicion, unable to escape either. Every few years, the sheriff's office reopened the file with fresh eyes, hoping new technology or a different perspective might yield results. Forensic teams reviewed evidence that had long since been cataloged, digital experts combed through her phone records again, and detectives revisited family members with questions they already knew the answers to. Each effort began with cautious optimism and ended with the same hollow conclusion. Nothing new, nothing useful, nothing that brought them closer to understanding what had happened on that night in 2008. For June and Walter, Claire's parents, aging brought a heavier grief. They kept her picture framed on the mantel, her eyes following them through the quiet of their home. With every passing birthday and holiday, their hope thinned, replaced by the ache of not knowing. They clung to her memory, but the not knowing became its own kind of cruelty, a wound that refused to heal. They wondered whether they would leave this world without ever learning the truth. Over time, The community's memory of the case dimmed. New tragedies rose to the forefront, new names filled the oblate headlines, and Claire's disappearance became just another unresolved story. But for those closest to her, the silence only grew louder. Each anniversary brought media requests that reopened the wound, only to fade again when no new detail emerged. For the family, the cycle was exhausting, a brief surge of attention followed by the familiar emptiness. By the time 17 years had passed, the file remained open but dormant, a reminder of the night that had fractured a family and left investigators with nothing to hold on to. Claire's absence hung over her children's lives like a shadow, shaping who they became in ways they could never fully escape. For her family, the mystery was not just about how she had vanished, but about how to live in the aftermath of something that had no explanation. And though the years dulled some of the rawness of that initial panic, one truth remained sharp. Without answers, time did not heal. It only deepened the wound. The case had grown cold, but the memory of that night at the cabin never stopped burning in the minds of those left behind. What no one could know then was that the truth had not disappeared. It had been captured quietly, frozen in time, waiting inside an old album for someone to finally look closely enough to see it. As the years passed and the official investigation produced no answers, the story of Claire Ellis's disappearance took on a life of its own. In the absence of evidence, theories began to spread, first whispered within the family, then carried outward into the community, and eventually woven into rumors that traveled far beyond northern Michigan. Each version reflected people's need to fill the silence, but none brought clarity or peace. The most persistent theory was that Claire had drowned. Lake Greeley was deep, its waters dark and unpredictable, with pockets of silt that could swallow debris without releasing it. Locals argued that if she had walked down to the dock that night, slipped and fallen in, her body might never have resurfaced. Divers had combed the lake in those early days, but currents and shifting sediment could have hidden her remains. For some, this theory explained the eerie stillness of her disappearance. Yet, the family resisted it. Claire was not reckless near the water, and her shoes had been left by the door. The details didn't fit, but the idea lingered nonetheless. Another theory gained traction in town, that Claire had staged her disappearance to escape her marriage. Over time, fragments of arguments between her and Daniel had been magnified into supposed evidence. Neighbors recalled hearing raised voices months before she vanished. Friends remembered her talking about being overwhelmed, about needing space. These scattered recollections hardened into the belief that she had planned to walk away, leaving behind the phone and glasses as deliberate misdirection. But when skeptics pressed for details, no one could explain how she could vanish without a trace of financial movement, no withdrawals, no purchases, no trail of survival. It was a theory that made sense on the surface, but collapsed under closer inspection. Inside the family, a darker suspicion began to grow, whispered in fragments but rarely spoken aloud, that someone among them knew more than they had admitted. The notion cut through blood ties like a blade, creating fractures that never fully healed. Some pointed to Daniel, his role as the last person to see her alive impossible to ignore. Others wondered about extended relatives who had been present that night, quiet faces in the background of memories now replayed with scrutiny. The lack of evidence allowed these doubts to fester unchecked. Each theory divided the family further, eroding trust until gatherings carried an air of unease. The rumors reached beyond family and neighbors, finding their way into online forums where strangers dissected the case as if it were a puzzle to be solved from afar. Amateur sleuths mapped the cabin property, argued over satellite images, and debated endlessly whether Claire had been victim, runaway, or conspirator in her own disappearance. To her children, who had grown up under the weight of speculation, these public discussions felt invasive, turning their grief into spectacle. Yet, they couldn't look away. Ava scrolled through message boards late into the night, searching for any perspective that might reveal something new, while Josh grew more resentful, convinced outsiders would never understand the pain behind the headlines. The The lack of closure ensured that every theory, no matter how implausible, carried emotional weight. Each idea planted new seeds of suspicion, keeping wounds open instead of allowing them to scar. Daniel lived with the shadow of accusation, never formally charged, but never truly free of the whispers. Lena carried guilt for not protecting her sister better, wondering whether she had overlooked a warning sign that could have changed the course of that night. For June and Walter, the parents left behind, each rumor felt like an insult layered onto their grief, painting their daughter as reckless, selfish, or betrayed by her own blood. Over time, the Ellis family became defined less by who they were and more by what they had lost. Theories and rumors hardened into a constant backdrop, shaping how they spoke to one another, how they faced the community, and how they remembered Claire. Yet none of these ideas, however persistent, could resolve the fundamental truth. Her disappearance remained unexplained. The speculation only deepened the mystery, dragging it further from resolution and leaving those who loved her trapped between doubt and despair. By the 17th year, the weight of these theories felt unbearable. Theories had given people something to talk about, but for the family they offered no answers, no closure, no peace. And yet, buried quietly in a forgotten drawer of her parents' home, single photo album held something far more concrete than rumor, a fragment of truth captured by accident, waiting to bring the silence to an end. 17 years had passed since that night at the cabin, years that had weathered everyone in the Ellis family in different ways. Ava, once a confused little girl calling her mother's name into the woods, was now 24. She carried the absence of her mother like a quiet shadow, one that followed her into adulthood. She had learned to live with the mystery, but never to accept it. Her brother Josh, a few years younger, had taken the loss differently, harder, angrier. The family rarely spoke openly about what had happened anymore. Conversations about Claire were like fragile glass, too easily shattered. In the summer of 2025, Ava returned to her grandmother June's house to help sort through boxes. June's health had declined, and Ava had taken it upon herself to begin organizing the clutter that had accumulated in the old home. Most of it was ordinary: stacks of mail, brittle holiday cards, and faded magazines. But tucked into the bottom of a dresser drawer, beneath a pile of tablecloths, she found an old family photo album. Its leather cover was cracked with age, the pages sticking together. Ava sat cross-legged on the carpet, opening it slowly, expecting nothing more than family snapshots she had seen dozens of times. At first, the pictures brought comfort. There were the familiar images of cousins roasting marshmallows, of her grandfather laughing by the fire, of children chasing one another through the clearing. Then came the photographs from that weekend, the reunion at Lake Greeley in 2008. Ava lingered on the images, her chest tightening as she stared at faces frozen in a time that felt both near and impossibly far away. Then she turned to a page that made her stop cold. It was a group photo taken on the porch the morning after Claire disappeared. Several relatives stood together, expressions weary but still hopeful, unaware of how quickly those hours would spiral into panic. But what seized Ava's attention was not the family in the foreground. It was the blurred figure in the distance, half hidden among the trees at the edge of the clearing. The figure's posture, the outline of the face, it looked unmistakably like her mother. Ava's first reaction was disbelief. She blinked, leaned closer, and traced the shape with her finger. It couldn't be. But the longer she stared, the stronger the certainty grew. The tilt of the head, the shape of the shoulders, these were features she had memorized from memory and photographs. Her heart pounded as the realization sank in. This wasn't a stranger captured by accident. It was her mother, visible in the background of a photograph taken after she was already considered missing. She carried the album downstairs with trembling hands. June, sitting in her chair, squinted as Ava placed the book in front of her. When her grandmother's eyes landed on the image, her face drained of color. She whispered Claire's name as though summoning her back. Word spread quickly. By evening, Ava's discovery had drawn Josh and other relatives to the house, each one taking turns holding the album. staring at the page in stunned silence. Some shook their heads, insisting it must have been a trick of light, a blurred cousin mistaken for something more. Others, like Ava, could not shake the certainty that the figure was Claire. For Josh, the photo reopened wounds he had tried to bury. He sat at the kitchen table for hours, staring at the image without speaking. Finally, he said what everyone else had been too afraid to voice. If their mother was in that picture, it meant she had been alive after the family believed she had disappeared. The idea was staggering, rewriting the narrative that had haunted them for nearly 2 decades. The family's reactions were divided, hope battling with dread. Some clung to the thought that Claire might have survived somehow, that she had been nearby, unseen while everyone searched. Others feared the opposite, that the photo hinted at something darker, that she had been there, on the edge of the clearing, before meeting a fate no one had uncovered. Ava could not let it go. She studied the photo under different light, scanned it into her laptop, enlarged the image until it blurred into pixels. Each time she came back to the same conclusion. It was her mother. 17 years of silence, of dead ends and unanswered questions, and here was a clue that had been hiding in plain sight all along. The discovery jolted the family out of the paralysis they had lived in for years. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, there was something tangible to pursue, something that suggested answers might still be within reach. They knew they could not ignore it. The photo album, once just another relic of the past, had become the spark that reignited the mystery of Claire's disappearance. When Ava brought the photo album to the sheriff's office, she did it with hesitation, unsure if anyone would take her seriously after so many years. The detective on duty flipped through the pages at first with polite detachment, but when his eyes landed on the blurred figure in the background, his demeanor shifted. He leaned in closer, adjusted the light, and called in another officer. Within an hour, the image was scanned, enlarged, and pulled onto a screen in the small evidence room. For the first time in 17 years, the case of Claire Ellis was no longer a forgotten file collecting dust. It was alive again. Digital forensics experts were brought in to examine the photo. Using enhancement software, they sharpened the outline, adjusted shadows, and corrected distortion caused by the camera's old lens. Slowly, the figure took form. What had once seemed like a vague blur now revealed the subtle lines of a face, the outline of hair, and a stance that seemed eerily familiar. Side-by-side comparisons with Claire's old photographs confirmed what the family already believed. It was her. Not a look-alike, not a trick of light. Her face, faint but undeniable, was there among the trees on the morning she was officially declared missing. The realization sent a chill through the investigators. If Claire appeared in that photo, it meant she had been alive after her disappearance was first reported. She hadn't vanished during the night as everyone assumed. She had been standing only yards away while her family gathered, unseen, her presence captured only by accident in the corner of a frame. The implications were staggering. Had she been trying to return? Was she being held back? Or was someone controlling when and how she could be seen? Detectives pored over every photograph taken during that reunion, searching for other hidden details. They re-interviewed relatives who had been present that morning, asking who had snapped the picture and why no one had noticed her in the background. The cousin who had taken the photo admitted he hadn't been paying attention to anything beyond the group posed on the porch. He had clicked the shutter quickly, never glancing at the tree line. That single careless photo now carried more weight than 17 years of searching. For the Ellis family, the discovery reopened wounds they had tried to close. Ava felt vindicated in her certainty, but the image brought more questions than answers. Josh stared at it in silence, wondering if their mother had been reaching for them from the shadows. Daniel, who had endured years of suspicion, now demanded to know why investigators had not found this sooner, why it had taken nearly 2 decades for the truth to resurface. The family's reactions oscillated between relief that Claire had been alive and horror at what her appearance in the background suggested. The sheriff's office announced that the case was being formally reopened. Press releases reignited public interest, and the story once again dominated headlines. Experts debated the photograph on television, some marveling at the evidence, others skeptical that an image alone could confirm anything. But to those who had lived with Claire's absence, there was no doubt. The face in the photo was hers. Investigators revisited the cabin site, retracing the events of that morning in painstaking detail. The photo was matched against the angle of the sun, the position of the trees, and the distance from the porch to the tree line. Forensic specialists confirmed that the figure had been standing motionless, watching. She had been there long enough to be caught by the lens, yet no one recalled seeing her. The possibility that she had been trying to signal the family and had somehow been silenced before she could was impossible to ignore. The disturbing nature of the discovery lay not only in proving she had been alive after her disappearance, but in what it implied. Someone may have known she was there and deliberately ensured she did not return. The photo suggested surveillance, control, or concealment that went unnoticed in the chaos of that morning. It was no longer a mystery defined by absence. It was now a case of presence, of a woman seen, documented, and then erased again within hours. For detectives, the photo was more than just evidence. It was a haunting reminder that answers had always been close, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to look closer. With the image authenticated, urgency surged back into the investigation. After 17 years of silence, the disappearance of Claire Ellis was no longer considered a cold case. It was an active crime scene once again. Under the renewed glare of investigation, the cabin at Lake Greeley was no longer just a summer home tucked in the trees. It was now a crime scene revisited after nearly 2 decades. Detectives arrived with forensic teams, crime scene vans rumbling down the familiar dirt road that had once carried children on bikes and cousins with fishing poles. This time, it carried cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating radar, and specialists tasked with combing every inch of the property that had been overlooked in 2008. The photograph was their starting point. Investigators retraced the angle of the shot, standing on the porch where the family had gathered that morning. From there, they followed the line of sight into the tree line. The patch of woods looked unremarkable, just undergrowth, pine needles, and the remains of old fire pits dug over the years. But the figure in the photo had stood there, still and deliberate, and that detail was enough to command attention. Teams marked off grids and began digging. The dogs alerted first. Near the edge of a shallow depression, handlers watched as the animals pawed at the earth, whining with a sense of urgency that sent a ripple through the crew. Soil samples were taken, then spades struck into the ground. Just a few feet below the surface, bones began to appear. What had started as fragments quickly gave way to a chilling discovery. A partial skeleton, burned in places, buried among ash and charred debris. Forensic specialists worked slowly, documenting each piece before lifting it from the ground. Among the remains were traces of fabric fused with soot, the remnants of clothing that had once belonged to a woman. Tests in the lab later confirmed what everyone had already feared. The DNA matched Claire Ellis. After 17 years of searching, her body had been found, hidden just steps away from where her family had been photographed that morning. The revelation shook everyone who had clung to different versions of the story. Those who believed she had walked away now faced the brutal truth that she had never left the property. Those who believed she drowned in the lake had to accept that her body had been on land the entire time. For the Ellis family, the discovery was devastating. They had stood in that clearing for days, calling her name, never realizing she'd been so close all along. Detectives examined the burial site with care, looking for signs of how she had died and who had placed her there. The shallow fire pit suggested an attempt to destroy evidence quickly, but the burn was incomplete. Among the bones were fractures consistent with blunt force trauma. The image that began to form was one of violence, followed by panic and a hurried concealment in the hours after she was last seen alive. The investigation pivoted sharply. Claire's disappearance was no longer an unsolved vanishing. It was a homicide. Detectives began pulling old interviews, combing through the original case files with a new lens. They noted inconsistencies in statements given by certain family members, particularly those who had been awake late that night. They studied the timeline again. Claire last seen around midnight, absent by dawn, then photographed at the tree line sometime after. The gap between those points was now the window in which everything had happened. For Daniel, the discovery was both a relief and a torment. He had lived for years under suspicion, burdened by whispers that he had killed his wife. Now the evidence suggested something else, that Claire had been alive the morning after, visible to the camera, only to be silenced soon after. The fact that her remains were found so close to the cabin suggested that whoever was responsible had been among them, blending seamlessly into the panic of the search. The family fractured once again under the weight of suspicion. Old arguments resurfaced, old resentments sharpened. Investigators interviewed everyone who had been present that night, pressing harder this time, armed with evidence instead of speculation. Some relatives grew defensive, others broke down under the pressure. But one truth became unavoidable. Claire's killer had been there all along, woven into the fabric of the family reunion. The photograph, once dismissed as an old memory, had forced the past back into the present. What it revealed was not only that Claire had been alive longer than anyone realized, but that the answers had been buried in the same soil where the family once gathered to roast marshmallows and share stories. The discovery was haunting, a reminder that sometimes the most important evidence is not miles away, but right underfoot. As news spread, the community reacted with shock. People who had speculated for years were now confronted with the grim truth. Claire Ellis had not run away. She had not drowned unseen in the lake. She had been murdered and hidden at the very site her family had spent years remembering her. For detectives, the question shifted from, "Where is she?" to "Who among them did this?" The search for Claire had ended, but the hunt for her killer had just begun. The reopening of the case forced every relative who had been at that reunion to face the possibility that someone among them had carried a secret for nearly 2 decades. Detectives combed through old statements, comparing them against the timeline reshaped by the photo and the discovery of Claire's remains. What they found were subtle cracks, inconsistencies buried under years of silence. One stood out, the recollection of her brother-in-law, a man who had always placed himself at the center of the search effort. His original statement insisted he had gone to bed early, yet relatives remembered seeing him outside by the fire long after midnight, drinking heavily. Interviews with family members revealed fragments of tension. Claire had argued with him that evening, though no one had thought much of it at the time. It had been about something small, money owed, a past slight, but witnesses recalled raised voices and Claire looking shaken afterward. Investigators now saw the detail differently. Combined with the fractures on her remains, consistent with blunt force trauma, it painted a picture that was difficult to dismiss. Forensic analysis of the shallow fire pit deepened suspicion. Among the burned debris were traces of accelerants not consistent with a campfire. It suggested a hurried attempt to destroy evidence, the kind of act carried out in panic rather than calculation. Detectives pressed harder, reconstructing the night step by step. If Claire had been alive at dawn, visible in the photograph at the tree line, then something had happened to her in the hours immediately after. And the person last seen near that same clearing, carrying alcohol and staggering through the dark, was her brother-in-law. When confronted with these details, his demeanor shifted. At first he denied everything, repeating the same lines he had given in 2008. But as investigators presented the enhanced photo, the DNA results, and the inconsistencies in his own words, the silence around him grew heavier. Relatives who had once defended him now stared with unease, remembering moments that had never made sense. Eventually, the weight of the evidence cracked through his defenses. In a closed interview, he admitted what had happened. That night, after most of the family had gone to bed, he had argued with Claire again, his drinking pushing the fight into violence. In a moment of rage, he struck her harder than he meant to. When she collapsed, panic set in. Terrified of what he had done and of the consequences that would follow, he tried to cover it up. He moved her toward the tree line, hidden in the shadows as the family woke the next morning. The photograph had captured her in that moment, her body standing only because he was propping her up, unseen from the angle of the camera. Hours later, he tried to burn what he could not explain, burying her in a shallow pit before returning to join the frantic search. The confession devastated the family. For 17 years, they had lived with suspicion and unanswered questions, never realizing the truth had been inside their circle all along. Daniel, who had carried the weight of being the prime suspect, broke down when he heard the details. He had been forced to live under the shadow of whispers, accused of killing the woman he loved, while the real killer had stood beside him during the search. Ava and Josh were forced to confront the reality that their mother's life had ended not at the hands of a stranger, but by someone they had once trusted, someone who had sat at their table and pretended to grieve alongside them. The photo album, forgotten in a drawer for nearly 2 decades, had shattered the silence. A single blurred figure at the edge of a frame had undone years of deception and revealed the truth no one wanted to face. The brother-in-law was arrested, charged with murder, and the case that had haunted the Ellis family for 17 years was finally given an answer. But closure came with its own kind of pain. Claire's parents, too frail to attend the trial, wept when told what had happened. They had lived long enough to know the truth, but it did not bring comfort. For Ava and Josh, the answers were jagged, cutting deeper than the mystery itself. They had longed to know what became of their mother, but learning she had been so close, hidden in plain sight, left them haunted by the image of her at the tree line, caught on camera one last time. In the end, the truth was more disturbing than any of the rumors that had filled the years. Claire Ellis had not disappeared into the night. She had not drowned unseen or walked away from her family. She had been killed in a moment of rage, hidden by someone who had blended back into the panic of the search, and only a forgotten photograph had exposed the lie. The case was closed, but the legacy of that reunion was forever changed. For the Ellis family, every memory of that weekend carried a new weight, the knowledge that the answer had always been there, frozen in the background of a single picture, waiting for someone to finally see it.